1942, the Atlantic Ocean, wide and endless, had become a cemetery without gravestones. Every horizon was a line between life and death. In the biting wind atop a merchant ship's deck, a British sailor stared at the rolling black water, clutching a silver cross under his uniform and whispering a prayer he had repeated so often the words were just habit. Words meant to keep him sane. Beneath his boots, the hull thudded and creaked, echoing stories of dozens of ships that never made it to port. Ships now resting somewhere in the cold dark. Their crews, just memories. Across hundreds of miles, convoys moved in tight formation, blacked out at night, running silent. It didn't matter if the cargo was fuel, food, or munitions. Every vessel was a target, and every crossing felt like a roll of loaded dice. The men knew the numbers. Some convoys lost half their ships before reaching England. Some lost all. Sailors saw friends step aboard in Liverpool, then vanish forever between Newfoundland and the Orkneys. At every mess table, at every change of watch, they felt the eyes of something unseen just below the waves. That something was the Kriegsmarine's pride, the U-boats. German submarines roamed these waters with almost supernatural stealth, each captain convinced of his own invincibility. In ports like Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, they sipped dark coffee and penned letters to mothers and wives, promising victories and safe returns. The U-boat war was a game of statistics, of patience and calculation, and for months the odds seemed eternally in their favor. Their periscopes cut through the mist. Their torpedoes struck unseen, leaving only a bloom of oil and fire. In Berlin, victory reports stacked high on admirals' desks. Propaganda posters showed cheerful submariners and wrecked Allied ships. "The sea belongs to us," the headlines boasted. U-boat crews received medals, promotions, and public adoration. The world beneath the surface, cold and mechanical, felt like the perfect domain for German engineering and discipline. For every U-boat lost, dozens of merchantmen disappeared. The Atlantic was the Reich's silent battlefield, and in 1942 it felt like the Allies would never regain control. But something changed. Something subtle at first. Among Allied command, desperation was turning to a strange sort of resolve. Reports of strange encounters trickled in. Ships that seemed to die, then suddenly fight back. Periscopes spotting helpless cargo vessels, only for the hunter to become the hunted. At first, the stories were dismissed as rumor, the inventions of frightened men. Yet in every port, in every captain's quarters, the whispers grew louder. Then, one cold midnight, a radio operator in a German U-boat transmitted a frantic message. "Help! They came out of nowhere. No warning, not merchantmen. Guns! Fire!" The line crackled, a burst of static, and then nothing. Silence swallowed the signal, just as the Atlantic swallowed ships. No one on either side knew it then, but the dead ocean had begun to fight back. Something new was haunting the hunters, and not even the most decorated U-boat captain could see what was coming next. The Atlantic in 1942 was a vast expanse of gray uncertainty, where every ripple might hide an enemy, and every clouded horizon seemed to offer false hope. But beneath that surface, in steel tubes smelling of oil and sweat, the true masters of the ocean waited. The German U-boats, Unterseeboote, had become living legends among Axis and Allied navies alike. Their names were spoken with awe and dread. The Sea Wolves. The strategy was as cold and relentless as the ocean itself. Instead of solitary predators, the Germans used the wolf pack, multiple U-boats coordinated by encrypted radio. A single U-boat would shadow a convoy, sending silent signals to comrades miles away. Then, under cover of darkness, the pack would strike. Torpedoes flashed out from the black water, and explosions shattered the night. Merchant ships, their crews scrambling for lifeboats, found themselves targets in a deadly game. Survivors spoke of the water-swallowing screams, of men vanishing without a trace, their faces burned into memory long after the ships were gone. For U-boat crews, this was the golden age, a time when the Atlantic was theirs for the taking. They were young men, many just boys, but the sea transformed them. They lived days on stale bread and coffee, eyes rimmed red from endless watch shifts, ears tuned for the creak of a hull or the echo of an enemy sonar ping. Yet every successful patrol brought reward. Leave in Paris, medals pinned to uniforms, the proud handshakes of admirals. One commander, Otto Kretschmer, Silent Otto, was a legend. He believed in stealth, striking only when he was certain of victory. His U-99 slipped through Allied defenses again and again, sending over 200,000 tons of shipping to the bottom. His letters home were spare and confident. "We do our duty. We make the enemy pay for every mile." To the men under his command, he was both a father figure and a myth, invulnerable, infallible. For the Allies, there seemed no defense. Merchant sailors, men from Liverpool, Halifax, New York, and Karachi, signed up knowing they were likely signing away their lives. Convoys crossed the Atlantic in tight, fearful formations, every man listening for the alarm that meant another torpedo. They painted their ships in drab colors and practiced blackout drills, but the U-boats always seemed to find them. Survivors' stories echoed in dockside pubs and military hospitals. A Scottish radio operator remembered, "We heard the whistle, then the world tipped sideways. The lights went out. I woke in the water, screaming for my brother. He never surfaced." Others told of miraculous rescues, of hours clinging to floating wreckage, watching flares light up the night, and waiting for a mercy that rarely came. The terror was not just physical, it was psychological. The U-boats struck invisibly, their wakes erased by the next wave. Rumors spread faster than the ships themselves. Stories of ghostly periscopes trailing the fleet, of torpedoes that circled for hours, of commanders who seemed able to read the Allies' minds. Merchant captains drank too much coffee, then too much rum, trying to still the tremor in their hands. Some began to dread the silence between attacks more than the attacks themselves. The impact was not just measured in ships lost, but in lives changed. Whole families waited for telegrams that never arrived. Towns along the coasts learned to live with empty seats at the supper table and new gravestones in churchyards. The British Ministry of War calculated the odds of survival and found them grim. Supplies grew short, hope grew shorter. And yet, for all the U-boats' success, there was a shadow growing behind their victories. The men themselves, heroes in Berlin and Paris, sometimes lay awake in their bunks, haunted by faces glimpsed in the water, by the knowledge that each triumph meant more families destroyed. A young machinist named Hans wrote in his diary, "We are told we are wolves, but I feel like a ghost. Each ship we sink is another weight I carry." By the end of 1942, the U-boat commander's confidence had reached its zenith. Even the Allied press called them the gray wolves of the Atlantic. The seas seemed theirs, unstoppable, unbeatable. Yet while Berlin celebrated, the Allies grew desperate. Every loss pushed them closer to collapse, or to a gamble. But defeat was not an option. Somewhere in the maze of London's underground war rooms, a radical idea was being hatched, a secret so daring that it seemed like madness. The masters of the ocean would soon discover that even legends could be haunted. What secret plan could possibly stop the unstoppable? See, desperation has always been the mother of invention, and by late 1942, the Allies were running out of both time and ships. Each week brought news of another convoy decimated, another vital supply line severed. The numbers were stark. Millions of tons lost, thousands of lives gone, and a continent teetering on the edge of starvation. Allied command grew gaunt from sleepless nights and bad news, haunted by the possibility that the Atlantic could never be won. In the hushed gloom of London's war rooms and the bustling naval offices of Washington, admirals and strategists pored over charts littered with the marks of disaster. The problem was as simple as it was deadly. U-boats struck from hiding, vanishing before escorts could respond. Traditional anti-submarine tactics, depth charges, convoy escorts, sonar, worked only when the enemy revealed itself. But the U-boat captains had become masters of shadow, slipping away at the first hint of danger. The Allies needed a weapon that could lure these predators into the open. It was then that someone, sifting through the forgotten chapters of naval history, stumbled on an idea nearly as old as submarine warfare itself: the Q-ship. During World War I, Britain had converted ordinary-looking merchant vessels into traps, heavily armed but outwardly defenseless. When a U-boat surfaced to attack with its deck gun, the Q-ship would lower its false panels and unleash a sudden barrage, catching the hunter off guard. The concept was daring, but in the decades since, it had faded from memory. An old trick, thought too dangerous for modern war. But now, with the seas lost and hope dwindling, the Allies had nothing left to lose. A few officers, restless, bold, perhaps even a little reckless, argued for its revival. What if, they wondered, the new Q-ships could use every trick of modern engineering? What if radar, hidden weapons, and advanced communications could give these ghost ships a fighting chance? Meetings stretched into the early hours. Arguments flared. Some called it suicide, others genius. The technical challenges alone were immense. Crews had to hide anti-submarine guns, depth charge launchers, and radio equipment behind clever camouflage. Every lifeboat, every coil of rope, every scrap of cargo was positioned to sell the illusion. The men who volunteered for the crews were handpicked: veterans, engineers, and merchant sailors willing to risk it all for a shot at turning the tide. Even the code names felt like something out of a thriller: Trap Convoy, Special Ops Vessel, Ghost Ship. Officially, they were just numbers on a chart. But in the bars and barracks, stories started to spread. Tales of haunted ships that returned with battle scars no merchantman could explain. Of crews sworn to secrecy who drank more than most, laughed less, and vanished for weeks at a time. The moral stakes were high, and not everyone in the Allied command was convinced. Using men as bait was a brutal calculus. These ships sailed with skeleton crews, each man knowing that the odds of survival were thin. There was always a chance a U-boat would simply torpedo them from a distance, never giving them a chance to spring the trap. Yet, in the bitter logic of war, there was little choice. When you have nothing left to lose, you try the impossible, a British admiral said grimly. And sometimes it works. The first of these new Q-ships slipped out of dock in the dead of night. Their decks were cluttered with empty barrels, crates of supposed cargo, and rust-streaked fittings. Everything about them whispered neglect, an easy target for a hungry U-boat. Below deck, hidden behind false walls and cleverly disguised hatches, were twin naval guns, anti-aircraft mounts, even depth charge racks. In the engine rooms, sailors worked in silence, knowing they were part of a secret war within a war. The crews, too, were ghosts of a kind, men who lived between two worlds, sworn to secrecy, forbidden to write home about their mission. They drilled constantly, practicing the sudden shift from helpless merchantman to armed warship. Some found a strange sense of pride in the charade. Others lay awake nights, wondering if they would ever see land again. One American gunner wrote, "I've never felt so invisible. We're the ghosts of the Atlantic now, and maybe, if we're lucky, the last thing a U-boat ever sees." Rumors soon reached the U-boat fleet. German intelligence picked up odd patterns in shipping reports. Some captains noted merchant vessels behaving strangely. Too slow to run, too eager to stay together, or vanishing altogether without a trace. The veterans, men who'd survived a dozen patrols, scoffed at talk of Allied tricks. They trusted their instincts, their training, their luck. But younger officers grew cautious, checking their charts twice, scanning the horizon for shapes that didn't quite fit. And so, the stage was set for a new kind of war. The Atlantic, once a domain of invisible killers, now held secrets on both sides. The hunters had become the bait. Now, they waited in silence, hatches sealed, hearts pounding, every sense stretched taut as wire. Would the German aces fall for the trap, or see through the ruse before it was too late? Captain Eric Bauer of U-558 stood in the narrow conning tower, collar turned up against the salt wind, binoculars pressed to his face. Another endless gray morning on the Atlantic. He had sailed these waters since the start of the war, outlasting more patrols than most of his classmates from Kiel. Some were now heroes in portraits, others just names chiseled into marble. He preferred the sea, cold, anonymous, unforgiving. Below, the men worked in a rhythm built from habit and fear. The air in the U-boat was thick, tinged with diesel and sweat. Bauer trusted them, trusted their eyes, their instincts, and the U-boat itself. The North Atlantic was where he belonged, and on this morning he felt that old predator's thrill. Somewhere in the mist, another Allied convoy was inching toward England. Another target, another day to prove the Reich's reach. Through the periscope, Bauer watched the convoy draw closer. From a distance, it looked like any other. A scatter of rusty, lumbering merchant ships, battered by weather and war. No warships in sight, just the same weary shapes he'd sent to the bottom before. He marked the largest, an easy prize, and issued the silent order to submerge. The tension was electric as U-558 glided below the surface. Every sound echoed. The sonarman's headphones crackled. "Nothing, Herr Kapitän." Bauer nodded. He preferred silence. When they surfaced, it would be in the shadow of that fat merchant man. The plan was as old as the U-boat service. Strike hard, strike fast, vanish before the escorts could react. Night fell. The convoy's navigation lights were dim, flickering like ghosts across the swells. The U-boat surfaced, creeping in the darkness, engines throttled low. Bauer gave the order. Up periscope, calculate range, open tubes. He imagined the torpedo's path. A silent killer. The thunder to come. His men watched him, faces pale but eager. They trusted him with their lives. A single torpedo. The ocean boiled. A merchantman staggered, listing hard, alarms blaring. Through the scope, Bauer saw men running on deck, heard the distant echo of shouts. He smiled. This was what he knew. This was how it always went. But then something shifted, almost imperceptible at first. The stricken ship, instead of breaking apart or stopping dead, held steady. Lifeboats dropped, but only a handful. The others waited unmoving as if on silent command. Then, beneath the camouflage of tarps and crates, hatches slid open. Guns emerged, naval guns, not merchantman's pistols. Spotlights snapped on, carving the night. The radio operator's voice cracked with panic. "Sir, they're signaling the others." A second later, the night erupted. Tracer fire arced over the waves, shells hammering the sea, searchlights sweeping the darkness. Bauer barked for a crash dive, but the ocean was no longer safe. Depth charges splashed in close, exploding with a force that rattled every bolt in the hull. The U-boat lurched, lights flickering, men thrown from their bunks. Bauer gripped the railing, heart pounding. This was no ordinary merchant. This was a trap. On the surface, the Q-ship's crew moved with lethal precision. Months of drills and tense waiting boiled into chaos. "Fire at will!" gunners shouted. Shells pounded the water where the U-boat had been, hoping to catch it before it slipped away. They had trained for this moment, lived for it, every man knowing that surprise was their only ally. Inside U-558, chaos reigned. The engineer fought to keep the boat level. the sonar man straining to pick up the sounds of pursuit. Depth charges rained down, each one closer, each one a heartbeat that could be the last. Bauer ordered the boat deeper, into the black, where the pressure crushed steel and men's courage alike. On deck, the Q-ship's captain watched the bubbles and oil slick spreading across the surface. "Did we get them?" a young gunner asked, breathless. No one answered. Silence returned, thicker than before. Men looked at one another, shaken by what they'd become. Predators hunting predators, ghosts preying on ghosts. For the survivors, the trauma was immediate and visceral. On the Q-ship, hands shook as the adrenaline faded. They had survived, yes, and scored a victory no one would believe outside the classified files. But the cost was visible in every drawn face, every 1,000-yard stare. No medal could erase the fear of being bait, of sitting helpless while death circled unseen. For Bauer and his crew, the lesson was harsher. In the dim red glow of the control room, silence reigned. "What happened?" whispered the youngest sailor, voice cracking. Bauer had no answer. He wrote later in his log, "We are no longer the only hunters. The ocean itself has turned on us." The word spread like wildfire. U-boat captains met in dim-lit bars in occupied France, trading rumors of ships with hidden teeth. Some dismissed the tales as Allied propaganda. Others, the old hands with haunted eyes, simply drank in silence. It was the worst kind of fear, the kind that changed everything you thought you knew. Meanwhile, on every Q-ship that limped home, battered but triumphant, a new legend was born. No longer just helpless merchantmen, these crews had become the unseen defenders of the Atlantic, haunting the nightmares of men who once ruled the seas. The ocean had played its cruelest trick. The helpless became hunters in disguise. And somewhere, beneath the waves, U-boat crews lay awake, wondering what else lurked in the endless dark. How would they respond to this new, invisible enemy? The answer would shape the next chapter of the war, and decide who would control the Atlantic's haunted waters. For years, the men of the U-boat fleet had sailed with a dark confidence. They were the predators, the silent killers, the gray wolves of the Atlantic, feared by every sailor and merchant captain who braved the open sea. But in the winter of 1943, the first ripples of uncertainty began to spread through the ranks, subtle as a shadow gliding beneath a moonlit wave. It began with whispers, quiet conversations between watch shifts, stories traded over bitter coffee in the claustrophobic warmth of a submarine's galley. At first, no one wanted to admit it, but soon, the rumors had the weight of torpedoes. A merchantman off Iceland looked ordinary, but when Carl surfaced to finish it, they opened up with naval guns. Another tale from Biscay. Wilhelm's boat was depth-charged before he fired a shot. Survivors said the cargo ship had more antennas than crew. The U-boat men listened, laughed nervously, then glanced over their shoulders at the encroaching dark. Panic spreads quickly in tight quarters, and submarines were as tight as they came. 100 feet of steel, 70 men, and no escape. Commanders began to doubt their charts, question every signal. The old rules no longer applied. No ship was safe to approach. No target could be trusted. A merchant vessel that looked battered and slow might be hiding a dozen guns behind rusted hatches. An easy kill could become a death sentence in seconds. For Captain Eric Bauer and his crew, the change was palpable. He noticed it in the way his officers scanned the horizon, longer and more anxiously than before. The way the youngest sailor, Dieter, double-checked every periscope sighting, muttering prayers under his breath. The radio operator, Hans, now kept his headphones clamped tight, even off duty, convinced that the Allies were sending coded warnings, signals only the doomed could hear. "Did you see how that ship turned, Herr Kapitän?" Dieter asked one morning, sweat beading on his brow. "Too slow, too deliberate. Like they wanted us to notice them." Bauer tried to brush it off, but he couldn't ignore the knot in his own stomach. His men trusted his experience, but what good was experience when the game itself had changed? Trust in German intelligence began to unravel. Reports from Berlin were contradictory and cautious, filled with vague warnings about enemy deception operations. The old confidence in signals and reconnaissance, the backbone of the wolf pack, was shattered. U-boat captains began to refuse orders, inventing mechanical faults to avoid assigned patrols. Some even ignored opportunities, letting convoys slip away rather than risk an encounter with the so-called ghost ships. Paranoia took hold. Each time a periscope swept across the sea, every merchant ship looked suspicious. Was that crane on the aft deck really a cargo hoist? Or a concealed gun? Why did that ship hesitate before sending an SOS? Even the weather seemed to conspire, fog swirling thicker around targets, as if hiding the Atlantic's new secrets. The psychological toll was immense. Men who had once relished the chase now dreaded every surfaced attack. Some developed superstitions. Lucky coins rubbed until the markings wore off. Prayers repeated with the desperation of condemned men. Rituals before each torpedo launch. "We are the hunters no more," Bauer wrote in his log. "We are the haunted." Word of the ghost ships made its way to the home front as well. Wives and mothers noticed the difference in their men. Letters grew shorter, sentences clipped. "All is well," they wrote. "The sea is changing." Some wrote nothing at all. A mother in Bremen wept over her son's final letter. "If I do not return, it will not be from enemy guns, but from ghosts I could not see." Among survivors, the stories deepened the sense of dread. A young engineer named Matthias described the night his boat surfaced beside a helpless freighter. "We were laughing, ready to use the deck gun," he recalled. "But the next minute, shells everywhere. Our hull buckled. We dove, but they chased us for hours. Half the crew went mad with fear." He survived, but many of his friends did not. In every port, men gathered to drink and remember. But their laughter was brittle, edged with something darker than mere sorrow. Leadership in crisis brought out both the best and worst. Some commanders tried to rally their crews with bravado, insisting that Allied trickery was a sign of their desperation. "We forced them to stoop to cowardly tactics," one captain proclaimed. Others, like Bauer, knew that courage alone would not save them. He urged caution, discipline, and silence. Yet even he could not erase the fear etched into the lines of his crew's faces. German Naval Command, faced with mounting losses and plummeting morale, tried to adapt. New protocols forbade surface attacks, pushing U-boats to fire from periscope depth and flee immediately. But this meant fewer kills, fewer victories, and longer, more dangerous patrols. Some captains abandoned wolfpack tactics entirely, sailing alone and in silence, as if afraid their own allies might be a trap. The Allies, sensing their advantage, doubled down. Q ships became more sophisticated, using decoys, fake distress signals, and even leak reports to lure U-boats into range. British and American intelligence spread deliberate rumors, sowing confusion in enemy ranks. For every successful trap, they celebrated quietly, aware that the war was not just of steel and gunpowder, but of nerves and shadows. The game had shifted. Once feared, now fearful. The U-boat crews began to see ghosts everywhere. The Atlantic, once a hunting ground, had become a haunted house. Each convoy a maze of mirrors. Each merchant ship a potential executioner. Aboard the U-boats, sleep was a stranger. Every clang of the hull, every strange echo, was a prelude to disaster. Men woke in cold sweats, dreaming of ships that bled fire and water, of comrades lost to tricks they couldn't see. Families on both sides suffered in silence. For the wives of Q-ship sailors, secrecy was its own torment. Their husbands came home changed, unable to speak of the terror or the triumph. For the families of U-boat men, each day without news was another step toward grief. The war had reached beyond the ocean, into kitchens and churchyards, into the hearts of those who waited. Still, hope and cunning survived in equal measure. The most seasoned U-boat captains began to experiment, adapting old tactics to the new threat. Some learned to shadow convoys from a distance, watching for signs of a trap before closing in. Others developed new codes, new signals, desperate to communicate without tipping their hand to the Allies. A few even survived encounters with Q ships, slipping away by luck or sheer nerve, and these men became heroes once more. Their stories passed along as talismans against the dark. But the stakes were rising on both sides. Allied strategists pushed for even more elaborate deception. Axis planners rushed to innovate, searching for ways to reclaim their dominance. New technology loomed on the horizon. Long-range aircraft, improved sonar, faster escorts, each promising another twist in the deadly game. Was it enough? Could the U-boats adapt? Or had the tide truly turned against them? The next battles would answer that question, not just in steel and explosions, but in the silent, desperate decisions made in the heart of every sailor who faced the Atlantic's haunted waters. The war was far from over, but the rules had changed forever. When historians look back on the Battle of the Atlantic, they count the victories by ships sunk, tons of cargo delivered, convoys that made it safely through the storm. But beneath those numbers lies another, more elusive kind of victory. One fought not just in steel and blood, but in the unseen shadows of fear and uncertainty. The Q ships, the so-called ghost ships, may not have single-handedly won the war, but they left a mark on the hearts and minds of all who crossed their path. In the immediate months after the Q ships appeared, the rhythm of the Atlantic changed. German wolf packs, once so aggressive, now hunted more cautiously. Commanders hesitated before surfacing. Orders were questioned and second-guessed. That thin edge of confidence, the unspoken faith that the ocean itself favored the U-boat, began to dull. As one historian later wrote, the true power of the ghost ships was not in the number of U-boats sunk, but in the number of U-boat crews who sailed in fear of a merchantman's hidden teeth. Allied convoys, battered and grieving, found a strange comfort in the new tales that spread from ship to ship. "They can bleed too," said an American signalman after his convoy survived a close encounter. "The wolves aren't invincible." In Liverpool, Halifax, and London, word trickled back from the front. The enemy was afraid. For the first time in years, hope flickered. For the men who served on Q ships, their missions remained shrouded in secrecy long after the war. Some found it hard to speak of what they'd done, the months of living as bait, the moment of springing the trap, the chaos and violence of those encounters. "We never knew if we'd see sunrise," recalled Tom Harding, a gunner from the British Navy. "Sometimes I wake in the night and hear the water on the hull, and I remember those nights, waiting. We weren't heroes. We just did what had to be done." Many Q-ship sailors never saw medals, their actions hidden behind classified reports and redacted commendations. But among those who knew, respect ran deep. Years later, when the stories finally came out, they were honored quietly. A new plaque on a village memorial, a service at sea, the gentle squeeze of a hand from a comrade who remembered. One family in Portsmouth learned only decades after the war that their father, a quiet dock worker, had once commanded a ghost ship, risking everything so that others might live. Veterans' reunions became scenes of both joy and sorrow. Sailors met again as old men, their faces lined by time, but their eyes bright with memories. They spoke in half-sentences and shared long silences, bound by the knowledge that only those who had waited in the trap could truly understand what it meant. There were tears for the lost, laughter for the absurdities, and, sometimes, a sense of peace for having survived when so many had not. On the other side, the German U-boat crews lived with a different legacy. Many carried guilt as a companion. Those who survived the war, like Captain Bauer, struggled to reconcile the man they'd become with the boy who'd first gone to sea. Some reached out to their former enemies, sending letters or seeking meetings with the men they had once hunted. In the post-war years, there were awkward reunions and unexpected friendships, moments when survivors of Q-ship attacks met the men who had once tried to destroy them. In these encounters, old enmities softened, replaced by a mutual understanding of what the ocean had demanded from them all. Historians, decades later, debated the true impact of the ghost ships. Some argued their tactical effect was limited, that improved sonar, air patrols, and code breaking played the larger role. But others pointed to the intangible cost, the psychological warfare, the stories that changed how men fought and how they remembered. As one scholar put it, in war, fear is a weapon, and sometimes it's the one you never see that does the most damage. For the families left behind, the legacy was more personal. Some waited years for answers, why a ship had vanished, how a son or brother had died. Others kept memories alive through photographs, medals, or the creased pages of a final letter. The war at sea was never just about strategy or tactics. It was about ordinary people swept up in extraordinary circumstances, struggling to hold on to hope. Yet, even as the tide turned, new dangers rose. The success of Allied deception spurred further innovations on both sides. Submarine warfare became even more complex and brutal, with new arms races in technology, new tactics of deception and counter-deception. The lessons of the ghost ships were not easily forgotten. In the Cold War that followed, the silent dance of hunter and hunted continued. Nuclear submarines in the deep, intelligence officers crafting the next secret plan, nations racing to stay one step ahead. With time, the moral complexity of the ghost ship strategy became a subject of reflection and debate. Was it right to use men as bait? To risk their lives in the hope of luring an enemy into the open? Was the shock and terror inflicted on U-boat crews a necessary evil? Or a step too far in the shadowy war of nerves? There were no easy answers. The veterans themselves, asked in later years, often shook their heads and said, "We did what we had to do. War makes monsters of us all, but sometimes it also makes heroes." As the last of the Q-ship sailors and U-boat men grew old, their stories found new listeners. In classrooms and museums, young people learned of the time when the Atlantic was a haunted sea, where ships played dead and men became ghosts to fight ghosts. Historians gathered testimonies, piecing together the forgotten chapters of a war defined as much by uncertainty as by firepower. The legacy of the ghost ships endures, not in monuments or grand victories, but in the way they changed the very rules of war. They proved that adaptation was possible, that even when all seemed lost, courage and cunning could tip the scales. They taught a generation that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one your enemy never sees coming. What, then, can we learn from these forgotten chapters of history? That the line between hunter and hunted is thin. That the cost of fear can echo long after the guns fall silent. And that even in the darkest waters, hope and ingenuity can find a way to surface. The Atlantic today is quieter, its storms tamed by technology and time, its waves carrying the cargo of peace. Yet beneath those shifting swells, the scars of war remain. On the charts, they are just coordinates, points where ships vanished, where men faced the end and sometimes became legends. But for those who listen closely, the ocean still whispers lessons from that long, desperate struggle. Adaptation was the Allies' salvation. When brute strength failed, they turned to imagination, transforming weakness into surprise, making ghosts out of ordinary men and ships. Their victory was not simply one of weapons, but of minds willing to question the old rules, to risk everything on a new idea. In every era, those who endure are those who refuse to accept defeat as destiny. But the price of underestimation was high, and the warnings of history are etched deep in every hull that rusts on the ocean floor. The U-boat captains, once sure of their dominance, learned that certainty can be fatal. Their greatest enemy was not the weapon they saw, but the one they never suspected. In war and in life, complacency invites disaster. The ghosts of the Atlantic still whisper, "Never get too comfortable in the dark." Yet beyond the strategies and the statistics lies a more enduring truth: the humanity beneath the uniforms. The men on both sides were sons, brothers, fathers, men with dreams and doubts, caught in a conflict that demanded everything. Some returned home, changed forever. Some never returned at all. Their families kept memories alive in faded photographs, and stories passed from generation to generation. Reminders that every battle is fought by people, not just armies. Today, divers drift over silent wrecks, hulks tangled in nets, cabins littered with the remains of lives interrupted. Each ship is a time capsule, a secret keeper, waiting for a curious hand or a thoughtful heart to bring its story to the surface. We study these wrecks not just to remember the past, but to understand ourselves, our fears, our courage, and our capacity to change when it matters most. As we close this chapter, we invite you, our viewers, to share your own stories, to ask questions, to help us uncover the legends still hidden beneath the waves. Subscribe for more untold WWII histories, for the voices that seldom made it into textbooks, for the lessons we still need to learn. Because the ocean is wide, and its secrets are many, the ghosts of the Atlantic will always be there, waiting for those willing to listen and to wonder, what other stories lie in the deep, still waiting to be discovered?